So if Atari does that, then Sega would counter with, But then Nintendo would end up wanting to make a whole new console that technically wouldn't even be needed. And if Sony feels that they're already in a good position as is, Okay, so let's see. So far we've managed to alter the outcome of the 1991 CES, stopping Sony and Nintendo from becoming enemies. But that really wasn't that difficult. I may have changed the outcome of that one event, but what I can't change are personalities. Nintendo's still Nintendo and Sony's still Sony. And while Sony may have agreed with Nintendo's idea for the plastic caddy, that doesn't mean they'll agree to everything. Up until now, all this team's managed to do is shake Sega up a little. And instead of Sega talking trash as they normally would, they now have to spend more time trying to find out how to beat this team we've created. The only gimmick I can see working for them now is, Sega is for the cool kids, which, believe it or not, is pretty much the same as today's mature rated games are for the hardcore. Funny how things like that work. But Sega better be careful with that one. It may work against Nintendo style, but we haven't seen any of the games that use the other part of the console. You all know what I'm talking about. Plus, we still don't really know how this will work for Atari's new console. Can anything in our altered events change the outcome of Atari's new console? There's a lot of questions, so let's see if we can get some answers. Let's go back to where we left off. A new console's on the way, being made by a company looking to make a comeback, and based on what's being said about it, it's scaring Nintendo and even making Sony sweat a little. At this point, we know what Atari's main competition is, but what we have to remember about their console in the real events is that the consoles they were originally trying to compete against ended up not being the consoles that would later destroy any chance of their success. But was the console they made even good enough to begin with? In 1993, the Atari Jaguar was launched with a price of $250. It was hyped as the first 64-bit console. However, during its first year, it failed to deliver any games besides an upgraded version of the arcade game Tempest. But what exactly did they do wrong? Well, almost everything. The first mistake they made was sticking to cartridges. Though I must admit, their actions behind that actually does make a little bit of sense. After all, the 16-bit consoles that tried to use discs failed in doing so. But sadly, this meant that a so-called powerful console was being held back by memory limitations, a problem that we all know another console will have later on. But that was just the beginning. The way the console was built made it extremely difficult for developers to truly take advantage of what the console could really do. But then that was actually a whole nother problem. The console couldn't really do that much. At least, not based on what was claimed in their advertisements. Saying it was powerful, but giving us games that matched the look of the Sega 32X, and in some cases even being matched or outdone by Super Nintendo's Mode 7 feature really didn't help. Their controller? Well, yeah. It was a D-pad with 3 buttons for gameplay, and had a 12-button number pad, a feature that failed before on their older Atari consoles, yet a feature they felt the need to repeat. Developers also weren't too fond of this console, and the games they ended up getting later showed that. Games like Checkered Flag and Kasumi Ninja were just cheap ripoffs of more popular titles. A game like Fight for Life looked terrible in comparison to something like Virtua Fighter, so imagine how bad it was in comparison to Tekken. Looking at our altered events, at this point it's already going to have a bad start. Yeah, they can still use their "our console has 64 bits of power" commercials, especially since everybody's still excited over 16-bit. But if the best they can give us are games that can look worse than the 16-bit consoles, what are the chances of a game coming out that looks better than the second part of a console we all know is coming out later? And with the way the console was made, there's no reason for developers that want to take their games to the next level visually to use this console with the way it's built, especially once developers start to take advantage of the disc format. Sadly, this console just can't succeed in our altered events. The reputation that both Nintendo and Sega have right now, as well as what's coming from both companies soon, will kill off any chances of the Jaguar succeeding. And it all starts with a meeting that Sony had. A meeting had been held with Kutaragi, President Oga, and some of the senior members of the board. In the meeting, Kutaragi revealed a system that was based strictly on CD-ROMs. This system would be able to play games with 3D graphics. Oga would later decide to hold on to this project, not so much for what he would feel as a positive financial gain, but more as a retaliation for the embarrassment that Nintendo had bestowed upon them 1 year prior. However, due to the disagreements from majority of the senior members not thinking in the same revengeful way, Kutaragi's team was forced to move to Sony Music. This would separate them from the main headquarters, allowing Kutaragi to hold on to the project in addition to holding on to the relationship Sony had with Philips. Yes, that Philips. During this time, Kutaragi and the CEO of Sony Music, as well as another man who I'm sure that most of us are very familiar with, got together and formed a group called Sony Computer Entertainment Inc. This team would later attract some attention, bringing in talent that would assist them with disc production, manufacturing, and marketing. In '93, the green light was given to the project by the executives, and Phil Harrison was recruited in to bring in developers and publishers, creating games for the new console. After a few tech demos were given to the game developers and publishers, it didn't take long for them to realize that this was the console they wanted to develop games for, one of which would later become partners with SCEI. Unlike limitations in pricing for the cartridges on the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo as well as their 16-bit limit, the PlayStation would attract a lot of developers with its use of 3D technology and CD-based games, which would make manufacturing cheaper. And within a year, well, it worked. So now in our altered events when Nintendo teamed up with Sony Computer Entertainment America, they can now... Wait, I can't do that. With Nintendo running things, Sony doesn't need that group. It was only needed originally because Sony didn't make games. Plus, their knowledge of the gaming industry really wasn't all that good, so they needed a team. So then how does this work out? This puts us in a real bad situation. All of the events that would later make the PlayStation the most popular and successful console can't happen in our altered events because we don't have SEEI to help with the production, manufacturing, or marketing. But then again, we do know that Nintendo already had a good chunk of the first and third party developers making games on their console anyway, so I guess there's really no need for that team. Nintendo already had their own version of it. Besides, it wasn't as if Sony stole those other developers. They chose to go to Sony, which means the problems Nintendo would eventually have later in the real events with their next console won't happen. But that also means what Nintendo would want to do later in our altered events could cause a problem. I think I just created an inconvenience for both Sony and Nintendo. I hope this doesn't turn out too bad. Let's just continue to 1995 altered events. Now in our altered events, things have changed. Nintendo's console is still on the top, but it's not so much because of Nintendo's titles, as it is the titles that Sony got that Nintendo would later lose in the real events, as well as the companies that would be exclusive to the Sony PlayStation. As time goes on throughout the year, developers wanting to take their games to the next level, or generation, would be able to do so. All of the launch titles that helped get the Sony PlayStation going now has the Nintendo PlayStation becoming more popular than it already was. And what helped Nintendo the most was, as I said before, they had a fourth and fifth console all in one. While Nintendo may have been somewhat neck and neck with the Sega Genesis before, now there's no chance. And the Jaguar, they didn't even stand a chance beforehand. Sega's only cool people play the Genesis gimmick? A joke now, as even the Nintendo PlayStation is starting to lead in sports games, and that very popular word we seem to like so much now, mature. But this puts Nintendo in a spot. Remember, even in the real events, Nintendo makes games, Sony makes hardware. And because of this, Nintendo's eventually going to find themselves competing with their own console. Super Mario World, A Link to the Past, F-Zero, Star Fox, all good games. But we can now see what they're up against. Nintendo may technically be dominating Sega and Atari, but in a way, their own first-party developers are dominating them. And as we know, when that happens, it's time to take it to the next generation. But most of us know what Nintendo ended up making in the next generation, and the current console Nintendo's using won't cut it. What's going to hurt Nintendo the most here in our altered events is that Nintendo is a game developing company, and when you're being dominated by other developers on your own console, that can hurt, financially as well as the ego. And looking at the real events clock, it's about time for Sega to announce something, Atari to create yet another mistake, and Nintendo to realize that what they're currently working on can't be done on their current console. But there's a secret to their current project, one that prevented Nintendo from doing what they wanted to do in the real events, but may be able to do in our new altered events. By this point, the Atari Corporation figured that their Jaguar wasn't going anywhere. Their cartridge games weren't selling. And Sony had proved that despite the failure of the Sega CD and TurboGrafx CD, when done correctly, discs are the way to go. To fix this problem, they released a CD-ROM based peripheral, which was manufactured by the same company that already came and gone in the gaming industry. Sadly, due to the high chance of the thing not even working, it became a failure almost the second it was released. Meanwhile, the console that we all know to be the Sega Saturn actually wasn't the original idea. It was supposed to be more of a 2D console that happened to have 3D capability. But when Sony announced their way into the console market, Sega changed their mind and decided to make a more powerful console, as what they came up with versus what Sony was coming out with just wouldn't be enough. So Nakayama wanted the console specs to be enhanced, to allow it to compete with Sony's. They did this by giving the console more processing power for 32-bit 3D games, but this had to be done in less than a year in order for Sega to release the console at the same time as Sony's. But they did it. Well, kinda. You see, Sega ended up using both technologies from their original 2D arcade boards and their new 3D arcade boards. Add to that their genius plan for dual processors, and you end up with a bit of a problem. Not so much for Sega, but other developers who found it rather difficult to program for it. As a shortcut, or I guess lazy way around this, they simply used C programming language, which was fine as far as making the game work, but sadly wasn't good enough to take advantage of the console's full power, which was the main reason why Sega made the console the way they did. So Sega ended up making a console that a lot of developers either didn't know how to use fully, or just flat out didn't want to be bothered. When the console was released in Japan, they sold 250,000 in less than 2 days. The PlayStation was then released a week later, yet for the next few months never caught up to Sega's sales. During the US E3's trade show, Sega debuted the Saturn in the US for $399. The actual release date was on the 2nd of September, but Sega wanted to beat Sony to the punch. But what they didn't know is that Sony's console would sell for $100 cheaper. That didn't help much. The jump Sega got on Sony made it difficult for developers to finish their games on the console they were having a lot of problems developing for. On release, the only game people were able to buy was Virtua Fighter. Between May and September, not many games were released, but what would end up giving Sega a real bad rep was that some developers were rushing out their games, and with the early release meant no time for advertising. So while at this point in the real events it's a battle of Sega versus Sony, in our altered events, it's technically still Sega versus Nintendo round 3. Don't forget about these. Which means that while Sega may be able to finally use the "we're more powerful than Nintendo" argument against Nintendo, the same way they would later use it against Sony in the real events, they no longer have the same reason to rush the console. As now the main problem that they have is that since Nintendo got the head start to the 5th generation without making a new console, they also got a head start on a lot of games already developed or are currently being developed for the console. With a better idea of what can be done with the Nintendo PlayStation, Sega already knows what they need to do to make the console more powerful since it's been out for almost 4 years. So Sega's problem went from hard to develop for to Nintendo beat them to the punch. But now we have a problem. Nintendo now wants a new console, not so much for the first and third party developers, but more for themselves. Miyamoto's new idea for their next Mario and Zelda game requires a more powerful console, but they still seem to be doing just fine financially with their current console. The games that Miyamoto's thinking of, however, would require a 64-bit console. A real 64-bit console. But would Sony agree to that? A whole new console just for Nintendo to create their own exclusive games, while the Nintendo PlayStation has a lot of first and third party support as is? And what brought this up? Well, towards the end of '94, the SNES sadly was approaching the end of its cycle, but not because people stopped buying games for it, or even the console itself, but because there was a bigger threat. Well, 2 of them. Because of this, Nintendo had been working on a console that would be able to compete with the new 5th generation consoles. They were rather quiet about this project, not releasing any information about the console, controller, games, or features. Nintendo had a main goal here, to create a chipset that'd be able to deliver the best video game experience at a price below $250. They made a decision not to rush the console to the market, but instead to give developers time to try and max out the console's power. They ended up selling the console with a price tag of $199 to make it easier to compete against Sony and Sega. But there was a small problem that would end up not only costing Nintendo a lot of third-party support, but would also prevent Nintendo and more importantly Miyamoto from creating what they really wanted to make instead of what we all ended up getting. When most of us think of games like Super Mario 64 or The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, we normally see those as 2 of the best games made on the N64. But sadly, the limitations of the cartridge prevented them from becoming what they could have been, and what Miyamoto actually wanted them to be. When it came to Super Mario 64, he originally wanted the game to have 40 different levels. However, when the final game was released, it only had 15 levels. But this wasn't a situation of running out of time, but more because they ran out of cartridge space. With The Legend of Zelda, however, the setbacks were a little different, as it had less to do with the limitations of the cartridge, and more to do with the talk of a new peripheral that was rumored, but never released. Despite what we all ended up getting, the original 64-bit version of Zelda was designed with the 64DD peripheral that was rumored in mind. The game was presented as a game so big that it'd be impossible to run on a normal N64. That's right, people. A console that hadn't actually been out that long was said to not be strong enough to play the new generation Zelda title. Miyamoto's imagination went rather wild on this one. He wanted to make it so any changes affected by Link himself would always stay that way. So when the game was turned off, everything would be saved, keeping the world exactly the way it was. Every tree you cut, every case you destroyed, it even came down to every footprint you left in the sand, saved in the game. With the 64DD, it was all possible. But as always, there was one problem. A lot of developers didn't really seem to have that much interest in the peripheral. Add-ons already had a bad reputation. Because of this, Nintendo themselves ended up losing a lot of confidence in the project. And due to Sony at this point dominating the gaming industry, making the N64 sales rather low, the original Zelda 64 project was changed. Hoping to renew interest in the console, Zelda 64 was then said to be suitable on a normal cartridge. But things in our altered events are different. Who would be Nintendo's biggest threat is now on their team. Something like this can now actually be possible. And if anyone can make this work, Sony can. Sony making a whole new console, while financially making so much from the Nintendo PlayStation sales doesn't seem very logical. But making a peripheral for a new console made by Nintendo sounds reasonable. But what exactly does this mean in our altered events? From our perspective in the real events, this would mean that Nintendo would have 2 5th generation consoles, but we can't look at it from a real event perspective. In the altered events, this now means that the N64 and Sony DD are playing the role of the 5th generation console. The problem with this is that the Nintendo PlayStation was just starting to really shine, and if we change the altered events so that Sony doesn't make the peripheral, then the N64 would go on being the same console it was in the real events, and would still be outdone by its own predecessor, despite it being the stronger console, simply because of Nintendo sticking to cartridges. The biggest problem Nintendo is having right now, once again, is that they make video games. They needed a new console, Sony doesn't, so they don't have to worry about it. But where exactly does this put us? In a triple brawl of new exclusives versus new multiplats, and a console that ends up being more successful in our altered events due to developers feeling it's safer, not liking what Nintendo's doing, and liking what can really be done with the Saturn when people actually try. Meanwhile, the Nintendo PlayStation is seen by some developers as the better console to develop for, since the console itself started off in the 4th generation, which means its fan base has gotten a lot bigger. The N64's Sony DD, however, is the console that some developers will still decide to try, but the developers that matter the most in this case is Nintendo themselves. If Nintendo's to truly try and beat out the competition, they're going to try and do so using a more powerful console, even if it's against one of their own. As time continues more and more, games get created for these 3 consoles, but Nintendo's pride will end up helping Sega's chances with their own console, giving developers more of a reason to actually try and develop for it. The Nintendo PlayStation would still end up being the top-selling console, due more to the fact that after its success in the 4th generation, once developers took their games to the next gen, that simply gave more people a reason to buy the console, which means Nintendo technically got what they wanted. But at what cost? But as most of you know, this is the time that news of Sega making a new console is released. But as we can all see, the biggest threat to that console in the real events is helping Nintendo. And Sega's new console, as some of us know, had a little bit of help. But if the console that would put Sega's new console down is now helping another company, then what happens?